Well, welcome for this thought for the day for the 1st of April. Today, I'd like to talk about this notion of staying and being in one place. As we find ourselves restricted and confined, and some of us completely cut off, I see myself going back to the wisdom of the past and those who have either through their own self-containment or the enforcement of others have found themselves leaning to learn how to be in one place and to stay in one place. I was talking to my brother earlier this week, and it's fair to say that he's finding the forced confinement in Kuala Lumpur, where he lives, quite a strain at the moment. He's been locked away, as it were, since the 17th, and he's really hoping that the proposed date of around about the 14th of next month, of this month now, of April, will be the day that he will be able to re-enter the world. One of the as a person who pursues a fairly contemplative path, the notion of remaining and being and staying in one place is not foreign to me. However, obviously, in this circumstance, we're talking about extended periods of having to stay in and amongst the company that are in our household or on our own, as is the case for myself, although I do have the dog. One of our great theologians and destined to be saints, Rowan Williams, wrote a wonderful little book called Silence and Honey Cakes, which is one of my favourite of all books. So I've returned to this book to see what he had to say. And I'm going to read this passage from the last chapter, which is all about learning to stay in places where perhaps you would think you would be better use elsewhere. So, reading from chapter 4. The theme of staying is a frequent one, suggesting that this was one of the most common problems in the desert. A saying of Abba Moses is probably the most often quoted on this question. Sit in your cell, and your cell will teach you everything. Learning to stay where you are becomes one of the hardest lessons of the desert, harder than apparently tougher forms of asceticism. Bearing your own company and the company of those immediately and unavoidably around you requires some very special graces. As John the Dwarf insists, if a man has the tools of God, the tools God gives him, he will be able to stay in his cell, even if he has none of the tools of this world. And if he has the tools of this world, but lacks the tools God gives, he can still use those tools to stay in his cell. But if he has neither God's tools nor those of this world, it is completely impossible for him to stay in the cell. Rowan goes on. You can cope with a certain level of demand for stability if you have some of the resources provided by the world, some of the skills which the monastic life tries to strip away, in fact. But precisely because monastic life seeks to take away your capacity to distract yourself in the usual way, by self-dramatizing and fantasy, you have a real problem if you are not open to God's grace. The problem is not just simple boredom. It is what the Greek tradition refers to as acedia, one of the 8 pressures on the soul identified by expert diagnosticians of the 5th century and later. It has to do with frustration, helplessness, lack of motivation, the displacement of stresses and difficulties from the inner to the outer world, and so on. So, some wonderful words of wisdom from Rowan and the ancients, the Desert Fathers, Moses and John the Dwarf. And it just goes to show that if we've got some of the resources of this world, which many of us have at this moment, I'm speaking to you via the internet, that is a resource of this world that can enable us to stay sane, as it were, to stay in one place. Or you may have Netflix or Amazon Prime or whatever it might be in order to distract you. However, even those things lose their luster after a long period of time. Even now I find myself strolling through Netflix thinking, there's nothing really here. But it is an opportunity for those of us who are open, as Rowan Williams says, open to the graces of God, that we can develop those tools that John the Dwarf talked about, the tools that God gives us. And in this moment where we may find ourselves stuck by ourselves and our own company, which can be a good or a bad thing at times, or stuck in a small house or even a large house with those we can't actually get away from and we have to deal with on a daily basis. This is an invitation really to open ourselves to God's graces, the tools that God gives. Some of the tools that God has given the church and those who have lived in solitude for many years, or in community but still in solitude, such as the Trappists. Tools of prayer, contemplative prayer, Bible reading, and correspondence, perhaps even in slower forms. Learning to communicate beyond our immediacy and the distractions of this world.